On one side, those who follow the communists, and on the other side, we have those who did not accept the communist rule, and among themselves there was many other groups which, for different reasons, have some sort of special ideas about how to build up the country in the future. I, by then, as a young student, belonged to a group of Vietnamese nationalist party called the Đại Việt Party. As a member of the Nationalist Party, I try my best, even by the time when there is the beginning of the fight against the French for the independence of Vietnam. We were in a somewhat very awkward position. On one side, all of us want to participate in the fight against the French for the independence of the country. But taking into account the very strict control of the communist regime, we knew by then that sooner or later the communists would try to destroy us. Fortunately, by then appeared the solution that all of us by then called the Bảo Đại solution. Bảo Đại was the former emperor of Vietnam. He leaves his throne. He became a counselor for the communist regime. But after a short period of time, he went to China. And from there, he was contacted by the French, and the French proposed for the return of Bảo Đại for a regime that is completely on the other side of the communist regime. Through negotiation with the French, Bảo Đại accepted to return to Vietnam, and by then the war continued between the communist regime and the French. The war that we called it French Indochina War lasted from the end of 1946 until 1954. By this time, the French still controlled South Vietnam, and it was there that Bảo Đại returned to form a new regime that called the State of Vietnam. But by 1954, the French suffered a big defeat at Dien Bien Phu, and the international situation was such that all the big country felt the need to convene an international conference to try to end the war in Vietnam. And so by then we had the Geneva Conference in 1954. Before 1954, in 1973, I served as a member of the government in Saigon under the regime of Emperor Bảo Đại, now called it Chief of State and no more Emperor. The solution in terms of how to deal with the French, we negotiated with the French to try to get the full independence. The French promised independence to Bảo Đại, but in practice they try to prolong their control of South Vietnam. And that is the reason why between 1953 and 1954 I had to participate in many negotiations with the French for trying to achieve the real independence on Vietnam, and not the kind of independence on Vietnam that was promised by the French then. And so it was at this time that happened the Geneva Conference in 1954. I went to France to begin to participate in the negotiations for independence of France, but independence of Vietnam with the French people. But in the same time, there was the negotiations in Geneva for peace in Vietnam. The Geneva Conference decided the partition of Vietnam into two parts. Above the 17th parallel, it belongs to the communist regime of North Vietnam, but south of the 17th parallel, it was the regime of Chief of State at Bao Dai. And so by then we came to the situation when in 1954 Bao Dai called on President Bùi Diễm to form the new government after the Geneva Conference.
So before move on, I would like to ask you a question a little back from 1954, which was at the time Ho Chi Minh formed the Vietnamese Fund, and they using the propaganda by saying that everybody united under Vietnamese to fight with France to get independence for the country. And I believe that your party, your nationalist party, that did also join them. And later on, he told many of the national party people to France or kill them. Do you have any memory or you know anything about that?
Oh, well, it was a very difficult period of time for all the nationalist party, because when the communists came to power, they tried to control everything. They did not accept the presence of the nationalist party. And so many of the members of the Nationalist Party, among themselves, many of my friends, students of the university in Hanoi, they were killed by the communists by then. And so the Vietnamese Nationalist Party were in a very awkward position, as I have mentioned it already. On one side, they would like to fight against the French, but on the other side, they knew very well that sooner or later they would be, well, completely destroyed by the communists. And that is the reason why they try to join the Bao Dai solution. In spite of the fact that they have a lot of reservation about the Bao Dai solution, the French promised independence, but in practice they try to prolong their control of the situation. And that is the situation in South Vietnam by 1953 and 1954.
You remember what's the principle for the Bao Dai solution?
Well, I think that the Nationalist Party, which supported the Bao Dai solution, they had no choice at all. They had to accept the solution, hoping that the French would really give back to Vietnam the independence they promised to Bao Dai. And that is the reason why through the years of 1952, 1953, 1954, we in the government in South Vietnam, we had to negotiate hard with the French. And the French gave up everything only after Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
So when you say that some of your friends, your party members were killed during the time, in the Ho Chi Minh, do you remember a few names? I believe some of your party leader also killed for your petty name. Tell two names.
Well, first of all, I have to mention the name of a very famous General Vo Nguyen Giap. In 1940, I was at the private school in Hanoi, Thang Long, and Vo Nguyen Giap was a professor of history. I remember it very well. But he was a very special man, in the sense that when he taught us history, he taught us only about the French Revolution and Napoleon War. And so that is what I remember most during my years at the Thăng Long School in Hanoi, when I had Vo Nguyen Giáp, by then a young man, as a history professor. As far as those people in the Nationalist Party who were killed or who disappeared one way or the other under the communist rule, I have a lot of names. A lot of names because they are my friends at the university in Hanoi. So I can give the name of those people who were killed, and a very well-known name. The name of Mr. Đặng Vũ Trứ, the son of Dr. Đặng Vũ Lạc, a member of the Nationalist Party, and the names of Đặng Văn Bút, Đặng Văn Nghiện, all of them students at the university in Hanoi. They are killed by the communists.
Okay.
Can you continue talking about the Geneva Convention in 1954?
Well, at the Geneva Conference, the communist regime in Hanoi, in practice, was the winner of the French. But under pressure from the international powers, they have to accept the solution proposed by the international power. It was the division of South Vietnam into two parts. The situation is somewhat like the situation in East Germany and West Germany, like the situation in North Korea and South Korea, because the international power by then think that it was perhaps the best solution for a situation by then. And so the communists in North Vietnam, under pressure from China and the Soviet Union, had to accept this situation. And South Vietnam by then had to accept the same situation, but perhaps a difference. The difference is that North Vietnam accepted temporarily the division of South Vietnam because they think that the communist regime will one day or another would occupy the whole Vietnam. While in South Vietnam, with a more somewhat beginning to be a liberal regime, we accepted the situation, hoping that sometime in the future it could be a reunification of the country, but a reunification through peaceful means, but not through war. The situation was quite clear. The North Vietnam did not accept the situation willingly. They had to accept it because the Chinese and the Soviet Union pressed them to accept the situation. But they dreamed of occupying the whole Vietnam, even through war, if necessary. While in South Vietnam, we accept the situation, hoping that one of these days, through peaceful means, that we can reunify the country exactly the way it had been done in the past in our history.
So that was the real reason for them to invade South Vietnam later on.
As I have mentioned, they had already prepared and the war against South Vietnam, and that is the reason why they left a lot of their people in South Vietnam, thinking that these people would form the fifth column for them in the future. And it was exactly this situation we developed later on in the years after, because those who were left in South Vietnam by the communist regime, they would develop it later on into a kind of rebellion against the government of Ngô Đình Diệm.
So we heard that they signed a treaty and we don't sign it.
Yeah, we don't sign the Geneva Agreement.
And if anybody signed it, that person would be you, right?
Yes. But they claimed at the Geneva conference there was an agreement according to which the troops of North Vietnam would withdraw to North Vietnam and the French troops would withdraw back to France. But in fact, they did not withdraw their troops from South Vietnam. And another clause of the Geneva Agreement was that it should be a kind of general election 2 years later. The communists later on took it as a motive, and they said that because there is no election in South Vietnam in '56, and that is the reason why we have to organize a kind of war against South Vietnam. But in fact, we did not sign the agreement at all. It was stipulated in the Geneva Agreement that it should be general election later. But South Vietnam, like the U.S., who was a member of those international power to participate in the Geneva Agreement, they did not sign the agreement too.
So we go further to the history show that after Mr. Bùi Diễm came to the power to replace King Bảo Đại, what will happen and how he involved into the Bùi Diễm government?
Well, everybody at that time thought that Mr. Bùi Diễm was a patriot. In fact, he was a real patriot, and he was an honest man too. But he had a very practical idea about how to rule the country. Perhaps an old-fashioned way of ruling the country from above. And that is the reason why later on he surrounded himself with his family and with a lot of people who agree with him. For those people who did not agree with him, they are pushed aside. And that is the reason why people said that Mr. Diễm was somewhat a kind of dictator. He was not really a dictator, but as I have mentioned, he had a very special idea about how to rule the country, and that is the reason why it developed into a situation later on in 1963 when people felt the need to have something change, and something changed. It became the problem of 1963 when there was a Buddhist situation developing into rebellion against the regime of President Diễm, and we had by then the coup against him and his regime in 1963, followed by a lot of other situations after '63. And I would say, and as I have mentioned in many of my books already, after '63 we had '64, and '64 was a kind of mess situation in South Vietnam. We had coup against coup, we had change of government, we have Buddhists against Catholics, we have students demonstration in the street, we have Northerners against Southerners, and that is the reason why by then the U.S. government felt that they had to intervene. But if we want to come back to Mr. Bùi Diễm, we have to say that the U.S. was very much in favor of supporting President Diễm. And during his years governing South Vietnam, Mr. Bùi Diễm did bring a lot of good things for South Vietnam. He created an administration, he organized the whole country, He welcomed the 1 million of Vietnamese refugees from North Vietnam, leaving North Vietnam to come to South Vietnam. So a lot of things, but somehow in politics you have this situation developing into a kind of very difficult for him to handle. And that is the reason why, in spite of the support of the US, his regime succumbed to the coup against him in 1963. We have to mention too that during the whole period of President Diệm in South Vietnam, the US began to commit themselves to South Vietnam already. In many of my books I mentioned that the US became first of all interested in Vietnam after 1945 because they sent a group of Americans helping the North Vietnamese in the border between North Vietnam and China by then. But it was only a beginning of interest. The beginning of interest developed into some kind of commitment. Commitment because the US helped the French in those Indochina War. A beginning of commitment already by then. But the commitment stopped when the French had asked for too much at Dien Bien Phu. The French asked for a global, a massive intervention to save them in Dien Bien Phu, and that is the reason why President Eisenhower refused to help the French by then. But and we came to 1954, and so in 1954 the US felt that it was very legitimate to help President Diệm reorganizing South Vietnam by then. The support to President Diệm lasted for many years, from 1954 to 1963. But when 1963 came with the Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam, the US seemed to get disenchanted with the Diệm and the Diệm regime, and that is the reason why people used to say that with or without the help of the American, the Vietnamese general could not organize the coup against Mr. Diệm. But somehow, in my view, the situation in South Vietnam became a mess in 1954.
Can you tell us the people said that, and also on all the paper from US side also recognize the involvement of the US side to the coup d'etat of Bùi Diễm? What is your opinion, sir?
Well, the situation in Vietnam was very serious by then because the Buddhist crisis was in full in the street of Saigon, and the government was very much in difficulty in controlling the situation. And that is the reason why the military group in South Vietnam felt that if they did not organize the coup, the communists would try to take advantage of the situation and organize a kind of open war against South Vietnam. In fact, by the time when we had the coup in 1963, there was a lot of fighting in the countryside between the troops of South Vietnam and the guerrilla left behind by the communist regime. And so on one side, on the political front, President Diệm had difficulties to control the situation, and on the side, on the military part of the country, there are a lot of fightings going on, and that is the reason why, combine the political situation with the military situation, the military people in Vietnam felt it was necessary to organize the coup against President Diệm. But as I have mentioned, without the help of the American or without the encouragement from the American, the Vietnamese general could do nothing.
From weekly and also from declassified paper lately, people mentioned about some CIA help to organize this coup d'etat, and they pay the generals and India, including Colonel at the time, Roosevelt, that pay to do that. Do you think that's right or wrong?
No, I do not think that the Vietnamese general were bribed for making the coup. Perhaps there's some kind of help here and there. But in general terms, the situation was such that, well, there is a combination of factors which push them to organize the coup, you see. And there are a lot of rumors and a lot of hearsay about this man accepting money from the American GOs or general, you see, having contacts with the American and so forth. A lot of things like that during a kind of confused situation like the one before the coup.
Later on, President Lyndon Johnson have some very strong comment about the people who did that coup d'etat in using like bastard or something like that.
Who?
President Johnson refer the
yeah.
of South Vietnam. I mean about the general later become the leader as a bastard. Do you think as ambassador you hear anything like that?
No, well, there are a lot of hearsay about everything. If we listen to all these kind of hearsay or rumors, there are thousands and thousands of these things. Let us focus our attention on the main facts of history to try to describe the situation. These kind of hearsay perhaps are small talks, very interesting to listen to, but in terms of history, it doesn't deserve much attention.
Yeah, I would like you to have some word on this, since it's been spread out so much. So as an ambassador, you maybe know better than people have hearsay. So that's why I asked the question for you to kind of express your position. That was the question, the reason for the question. Now I would like to once again focus back into the history.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Well, first of all, in 1963, after the coup, as I have mentioned it already, it was a kind of messy situation in Saigon. I took advantage of this situation to travel to the US because I was very much impressed by, for instance, in the speech from John F. Kennedy when he came to power, the famous inaugural speech from John F. Kennedy, that I tried to have an opportunity to visit the US. And that is the reason why I made it my first trip to the US in 1954. I went to the US, I came to San Francisco to participate in the Republican convention through which Senator Goldwater was the Republican candidate. We have to mention that after the coup in Saigon in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. And President Johnson came to replace Kennedy by then. So it was 1964. And so in 1964, it was the beginning of the general election, re-election for Johnson. And that is the reason why I went to see the Republican convention in San Francisco, at which Senator Goldwater was chosen as candidate on the side of the Republican against Johnson by then on the Democratic side, you see, on the Democrat side. I spent 2 months in the US, and it was the first time for me to look at the system, the American political system through which people got elected. But in the same time, it is a very, very special, because in August 1964, I had the opportunity to attend a session of the US Congress through which President Johnson asked for the authority to intervene military in South Vietnam, because one of the US ship in the Bay of the Gulf of Tonkin, was torpedoed by the communists, and it is a very, very, very special by then, because the Congress of the US by then adopted a resolution that it was later called the Bay of Tonkin Resolution of 1964. I was very impressed by this session of the US Congress, because among the 100 senators, 98 from them voted for the resolution. And for the 35 members of the House, all of them voted for the resolution of what we call the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So through this resolution, President Johnson had the authority to intervene military in South Vietnam. And that was the deepening of the US commitment to Vietnam after the sending of some 20,000 of advisors by President Kennedy by then, you see. So the problem is that from the initial interest through partial commitment, and it became later on with the Tonkin of Gulf of Tonkin Resolution a full commitment. The full commitment in '64 became total massive commitment in 1965 with the landing of the Marines in Da Nang in March 1965.
So I would like to ask you a question about that. As part of the government of South Vietnam in 1965, did the U.S. government ask the permission to send troops over there or not, before they sent troops over there or not?
Again, I have to say that it was a very confused situation in terms of relation between the US and Vietnam at that time. I was at that time minister at the Prime Minister office for Prime Minister Phan Huy Quat. He came to power, becoming Prime Minister in February 1965. February 1965. And one early morning in March 1965, early morning I was called by Dr. Quat, come to my home because we have urgent matters. And when I came to his home, I saw Mr. Manful, political counselor of the US Embassy in Saigon, over there already at Prime Minister Quat home. He said to me, Dr. Quat said to me, the Prime Minister, well, can you explain to me why in a sudden you have the landing of the Marines in Da Nang? He said to me that just a few days earlier, Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, General Maxwell Taylor, told me that perhaps we have to reinforce the defense of the airport of Da Nang, because from Da Nang the American planes flew north to North Vietnam in an operation bombing North Vietnam, and so we have to defend Da Nang, and that is the reason why we have to accept the landing of the Marine in Da Nang. Well, I would say that it was not totally a surprise, but a surprise in itself, because even Maxwell Taylor later on admitted that he opposes the landing of the Marine like that. In an official cable from Maxwell Taylor and Ambassador Johnson, the deputy ambassador by then, they sent back to the White House a cable telling that, well, they were not informed themselves about the landing of the Marine in Da Nang. So I just tried to describe the confusion by then between American establishment in Saigon and the military decision in Washington, and on the other side of the military embassy in Saigon, we have the government of South Vietnam. We knew nothing about it, you see. So the landing of the Marine in Da Nang in March 1965 was almost a complete surprise for everyone, including, I would say, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, because it was a decision taken from above, pushed by the military establishment in Washington, and Maxwell Taylor, the ambassador, as well as the deputy ambassador, they were not so totally informed about the exact nature of the landing of the Marine in Da Nang. It was only later on that they sent back some kind of, protest against it.
So, did your government respond to that decision, to that action of landing Marine in Vietnam soil without obtaining any sort of agreement, approval?
Well, we were in a situation such that the Vietnamese government could do nothing but to acknowledge this situation, because even the U.S. Embassy didn't know the whole thing. And how can the Vietnamese, refuse the landing when it is a fact that already the landings were on the beach of Da Nang already, and they have to accept it, and we have to describe it as a kind of tacit acceptance from the South Vietnamese government. And the situation developed quickly in the next few months, up to the point that after the landing of the Marines in Da Nang, the U.S. military establishment in Washington sent more troops into South Vietnam by then. And so little by little, later on, it became a kind of massive involvement, up to almost 500,000 men in 1967.
So in your own opinion, do you think that's a good idea to bring a foreign force into the country, especially letting don't have any prepare for the public opinion or any sort of preparing for the acceptance or the approval of Vietnam, Vietnamese?
Well, the Vietnamese government by then I was part of the government by then because I was the minister at the Prime Minister's office. We are fully aware of the very difficult situation, politically speaking, because the communists could very easily condemn us for accepting the presence of foreign troops in Vietnam. I have to mention right away that later on they accept the presence of the Chinese troops in North Vietnam, but nobody knows about it. The international opinion knew only about what we called the massive intervention of the US troops in South Vietnam, but they knew nothing about the intervention of the Chinese troops in North Vietnam too. And so, in the government, we are fully aware of the very awkward position in which we found ourselves, because we had to accept the presence of foreign troops. While in North Vietnam, they claim that they have no foreign troops to help them by then. And so it was in this awkward position that later on we have to go on trying to defend ourselves. And I remember very well myself when in 1966 at the Manila conference, personally I have to put in a clause of a communique according to which the US troops withdrew from South Vietnam immediately 6 months immediately after the end of the war, just to prove to the international opinion and to the international world that the Vietnamese government was not a puppet government and the Vietnamese government was a legitimate government asking the help of the American, but thinking always in terms of asking the American troops to leave South Vietnam as soon as peace comes.
So did the government, South Vietnamese government, did anything to tell the Americans that it's not right and we oppose that? Did Prime Minister Phan Huy Quát did anything in terms of telling the Americans that not a good thing to do or anything?
Oh yes, we had very, very frank discussions with Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Johnson. But the government of Dr. Quát lasted only just a few months. Yes, from February 1965 to June 1965, around 4 or 5 months. And after that came the government of the two generals, General Kỳ and General Thieu, in June 1965. Well, by then we had already a massive presence of American troops in South Vietnam, what we call a de facto situation in South Vietnam already.
So we go further. In 1968, there was a state of offensive and communists attacked many cities in the country. And we interviewed many South Vietnamese officers and soldiers, and they said that it was a surprise attack. And the situation in a way was terrible because the North Vietnamese soldiers came into the city, infiltrated into the city, and have a list in their hand to hunt for people to kill, and the result was over 5,000 were killed, buried in a mass grave, and so on and so on. Can you tell us about how is that happened, and your opinion, and also what were you doing with, and then you have anything to do with in terms of talking to U.S. government, because I believe after that war they decided to withdraw that war about that.
I have to mention right away that I was in the government in 1965, beginning February until June, but after Dr. Quát withdrew from the government, I was immediately after by General Kỳ to help in terms of what we call assistance for foreign aid.
But look like the war turned the other way and gone down from there. Can you explain?
Well, we just talked about the beginning of the massive involvement of the U.S. in Vietnam through the landing of the Marines in Da Nang in 1965. From then on to the Tet attack of 1968, it was a period of 3 years, during which the situation in Vietnam, military speaking, was very much under control. And it was then that came the surprise attack of the communists throughout the country. Military speaking, it was a defeat of the North Vietnamese. A defeat that right now, even the North Vietnamese, in their history books, they have tacitly have to accept it, have to recognize it, that it was defeated. But politically and psychologically speaking, they did achieve a lot of success because the Tet attack had a very big influence on the U.S. administration. This kind of big influence on the U.S. administration, I had the chance to witness this change, the beginning of the change, the beginning of the mood in Washington by then. I was in Washington when the Tet attack began. Through a few weeks of stabilization of the situation, I want to come back to Saigon to brief the government in Saigon about the mood in Washington after the Tet attack. I met with a lot of American congressmen, senators, and journalists to try to feel the atmosphere. But I said to myself that if we come back to Vietnam, well, how about trying to see the U.S. president? Without the U.S. president, it is quite difficult to have a real good feeling of the situation. But it is not very easy to see the U.S. president. Well, because normally an ambassador, when he came to Washington, well, perhaps one or twice every year we have a reception and we have a state dinner like that. So we have hundreds of ambassadors. So, well, there is no way to talk to the president by then. I tried my best. So I talked to a friend of mine in the White House who worked with John Rostow, Walt Rostow. Walt Rostow was the national security advisor to President Johnson. And I told Rostow that, well, please, I would like to see the president. I know that it is not a kind of normal request like that, but please try. I was not hopeful at all, but the next day the office of Rostow called me and said that, come to my office and we'll see. So very late on the day, I came to the office of Walt Rostow. I sat with Rostow for a while, and after that, his deputy brought me to the Oval Office to see President Johnson. I have many opportunities to see President Johnson during the meeting in Honolulu, the meeting in Guam, and I I saw a man very energetic and ebullient, talking, gesticulating, and everything like that. But by the time I saw in the White House, this day in March 1968, I saw a man very silent, putting his hands like that, and asked me, what is the situation in Vietnam? I tried to present to him the very optimistic picture of South Vietnam after the death attack of 1968. But I saw a different man from the man I quite often saw before. He was very silent, asking me just a few questions, and after that he confided to me, well, we are in a very dangerous situation because if we don't try our best, it is very difficult, you see. Listening to the man who was at the height of his power, President of the US, and at the same time leader of the free world, having to admit that we have difficulties in the war. It was quite an atmosphere for me. After almost an hour, I left the White House very sad, going through the corridors of the empty corridors of the White House by then, because it was 6 or 7 o'clock in the afternoon. I rushed back to my office and put down in writing what President Johnson just told me, so not to forget the words of President Johnson himself. And that is the reason why I put it here in my calendar. President Johnson on 18th of March, he said to me, I cannot hold alone. We are in deep trouble if we don't win. That is exactly the word of President Johnson when he told me like that. It is like that in my calendar. I put it here on the 18th of March, 1968. The next day, after seeing President Johnson, I tried to see the new Defense Minister, Clark Clifford. I knew Clark Clifford before because he was a lawyer, international lawyer, talking in diplomatic terms always, you see, very, very polite man. But this day when I saw him, after I saw President Johnson, he was very brutal in his words with me, talking about the rumors about the difference between General K and General Thieu in Saigon. He said to me, we are fed up with the fight in Saigon. So, and in saying this, a few words he said to me, we are sick to death about the fight in Saigon. Our support to Vietnam is limited. We have to find a solution before we have to face a disaster. That is the exact word of Clark Clifford when I met him at that day. And I was not yet completely satisfied. I asked to see Secretary of State Dean Rusk by then. And when I saw Dean Rusk said to me, we have no choice right now. We cannot win a military war, but we have to seek an honorable peace. That is the words from Secretary of State Dean Rusk to me. So after seeing the three men, I rushed to reserve my plane to get back to Saigon right away. So I told the leader in Saigon that it is impossible for me not to see a beginning of change in Washington when I see President Johnson telling me in his own words that we have to win the war or we are in big difficulty, and one Clark Clifford in a very brutal term talked to me about the situation, and even Dean Ruskin when he talked about trying to find an honorable situation to the end of the war. How can you not to understand that there is a beginning of change in Washington by then? And so I conveyed to Saigon what I saw, what I listened after meeting with the three men at the White House and at the Defense Department and at the State Department in the same time. So that is the beginning, from my own point of view, the beginning of the disengagement of the U.S. from the war in Vietnam. How the U.S. is to get disengaged from South Vietnam, that is a problem for the next few months, because it was in '68. That is the beginning of the preparation of the election for the end of the year, because at the end of '68 it was the election, presidential election, at which President Johnson refused to be a candidate. So the beginning of the disengagement began with Johnson. But later on we will see that it would continue with Nixon when he came to power too.
So what went wrong? I thought we were winning in a way, and the offensive battle. What went wrong? Why is that they changed from very much supported in 1965, 3 years later, and then we were winning?
Yes, the situation is very, very stabilized after the Tet attack already. He didn't say exactly this word, but the meaning was that we lost the war and already it is time for the U.S. to withdraw from the whole thing. So, along with the kind of feeling from President Johnson that I saw from the meeting that when I saw him, I felt that from my personal point of view that there was the beginning of disengagement from the U.S., of the U.S. from the war in Vietnam. So when Nixon came to power, I tried to see right away Henry Kissinger. I saw him before because when he came to Saigon in 1965, when Ambassador Abbott Lotcho was there, I had invited him to my home for dinner. And along with many Vietnamese politicians, we had conversation with him. And we in South Vietnam, we were amazed to see a professor from the university in the U.S. so interested in the problem of Vietnam. And later on in November 1968, we saw an article from Henry Kissinger talking about the way to have negotiations already. He didn't say exactly in these words, but we felt right away that the man is talking about how to engage the North Vietnamese in some sort of talking sometime, somewhere, you see. And so that is the reason why immediately after the coming to power of the Nixon administration, I tried to see right away Dr. Henry Kissinger. Well, he was a very, very cordial with me because, well, I saw him before in Saigon. I invited him to my home. We had a very easy conversation in normal terms, you see. But sometimes I felt that through the contact I had with the U.S. media, Bernie Kahn, Marvin Kahn, Joseph Kraft, because I had every day, almost every day of the week, I lunched with the journalist. I tried to understand the situation. And I felt that there is something like at the beginning of the whole thing. And that is the reason why 1969 and the beginning of 1970, I wrote a long report to President Thieu, in which I put in a very, very clear terms here. I say that from my point of view, the US is going to stay in Vietnam for a period of 3 years, or if we can prolong this period, it would be a maximum of 5 years. That is in this kind of report that I sent back to President Thieu. I am very convinced that somehow the US is going to withdraw. It is only a matter of time, and it is a matter of how. But the US was definitely on the road to get out of South Vietnam, to get out of the war.
So I did interview CIA. His name is James Parker. He wrote a book called Last Man Out. Indicated that he was the last, U.S. service got out of Vietnam after Saigon fell. And I asked him that, you regret what, and then you want to do something that you didn't do, and then he told me that, well, I failed to come to meet Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, and look at his eyes and said, we are winning the war. This war is winnable, and then don't listen to word of contact. And my question to you, what would you tell President Johnson, on the meeting that you just said that he changed and he looked like very, very sad and very worried about the war. What did you tell him? Did you tell him that we're winning?
Yes, but we have to mention, and I failed to mention this problem up to now. That is a problem of the public opinion in the US by then. You remember, and a lot of news media men, they know about the anti-war demonstrations in the US. Sometimes they demonstrated against the war in front of the Vietnamese embassy. Sometimes they demonstrated at the Pentagon. And the public opinion in the US was against the war. That is quite natural. Very natural from my point of view, because the soldiers from the US Army were soldiers that they had to go to war. And the mother of those soldiers, they are concerned about their son going to war. It is not yet a kind of an army of volunteers, but it was an army of conscripts, you see. So the mother of the soldiers were concerned about their son. And the public opinion in the same time very much influenced by the journalists like Walter Cronkite, who reported about the war, about the bad side of the war, you see. So the whole US public opinion, through the demonstration in the street and through the kind of opinion from the mothers of the soldiers, American soldiers who fought in Vietnam, it went up to a point that President Johnson could not ignore the public opinion. And that is the reason why he was so disappointed by the result of the Tet attack, in spite of the fact that it was a military victory for our side. It was a military victory but it was defeated in terms of political and in terms of psychological situation that was influenced by the public opinion very much against the war. This kind of situation in the U.S. after the Johnson administration continued with the Nixon administration. And that is the reason why the Nixon administration tried to adopt a new policy that they call later on Vietnamization of the war. Vietnamization of the war because they transfer to the Vietnamese the responsibility of waging the war against the North. The Vietnamese Vietnamization policy was widely accepted by the Vietnamese because we said by then that we had the responsibility to do the war ourselves, and the American can withdraw, but we hope that they can continue to help us. And that is the situation which later on, when the U.S. withdrew completely from South Vietnam after the conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 1973, that the Vietnamese had to do the war by themselves. But unfortunately, they had to do the war by themselves without the help from the Americans in the end. And that is the reason why they did not succeed in defending South Vietnam against the invasion from the North in 1975.
So we were talking about the public opinion didn't support the war, and that's why the war turned that way. But people also said that at that time, American interest was also shift into Middle East. That's why we're talking about Henry Kissinger going to China for negotiation. So can you explain?
Well, I did mention to you earlier the resolution from the U.S. Congress, we call it the Tonkin Resolution in 1964. So it is only a matter of few years between August 64 and March 1968. So the situation in the U.S. was from supporting the war in Vietnam, supporting the U.S. intervention. And it was a support that accepted by the almost totally number of the total number of the U.S. senators by then, and the total number of U.S. congressmen by then. It means that almost the total absolute majority of the U.S. Congress for supporting the war. And it became later on, a few years later, the beginning of the disengagement from the policy of supporting South Vietnam. We talked about the coming to power of the Nixon administration, and with the U.S. foreign policy in the hands of Dr. Henry Kissinger. So we talked about the beginning of what we call the Vietnamization of the war in Vietnam. Vietnamization means a gradual transfer of responsibility from the U.S. Army to the South Vietnamese Army. And it was quite a successful policy. But in the same time, we have to recognize the fact that even if it was a success of American policy, the Vietnamization of the war, the U.S. had to withdraw anyway. And that is the reason why the Nixon administration, on one side, helping the South Vietnamese to fight the war themselves, and in the same time trying to find a way through diplomatic channel to find the war, to end the war too. And that is the situation of in South Vietnam, under control with the Vietnamization policy on one side, and on the other side, the U.S. administration under Nixon and Kissinger trying to help South Vietnam, but in the same time trying to find ways through diplomatic channel to have a conclusion of the war. We can say that from 1970 to the situation was quite good in South Vietnam, because in 1972 the communists organized a big offensive. We call it mùa hè đỏ lửa, the fiery summer of 1972. The attack at Quang Tri, the attack at Hue, the attack in some other part of the South Vietnamese territory too, but everywhere they failed. And it demonstrated quite the success of the Vietnamization policy, in spite of the fact that the South Vietnamese army was quite extended a period after 70 and culminating with the 72, but without success in 72, but continuing with the negotiations in Paris through Henry Kissinger and the team in Paris. In 1968, I was ambassador in the US. But by then, there was a beginning of the talks in Paris. Somehow, I don't know why, the Vietnamese government felt it necessary for me to accumulate the responsibility in Washington and the responsibility in Paris. So every week I had to make the shuttle between Washington and Paris. On Monday I took the plane from Washington. I arrived early morning in Paris. On Tuesday I stayed in Paris until Thursday. I returned to Washington for the weekend to do my job in Washington and return to Paris the next Monday. The next job in Paris.
And you continue to talk about Paris negotiation.
Well, I just mentioned that the U.S. began the negotiation with the communist side from May 1968 to the end of 1972, and the conclusion of the agreement in Paris was in January 73. But it is very, very interesting to describe the negotiations in Paris from the beginning to the end. We call it negotiation, but at the beginning it was not negotiation at all. The two sides got together at the Majestic Hotel. And They have their speech, the Americans have their speech too. And so it continued after a kind of completely useless conversation from the two sides, that there was no meaning at all to the kind of what we call not negotiation, but we call conversation. Not even conversation. We call it talking more than conversation or negotiation. I was on the outside because at the beginning it was between the Americans and the North Vietnamese. But at the end of 1968, the Americans suggest that, well, we have to have on our side that the South Vietnamese government, because the other side, they would like to have on their side the National Front of Liberation. And by then there was discussions about what kind of flags that you bring over there, what kind of table, round table or square table or rectangular table. Nobody agreed about it, up to the point that later on we agree on the four sides. The two sides on their side and the two sides on our side. And it is with this kind of situation that we, on our side, we began the conversation with the other side. It lasts for 2 years, like that. Every week or every 2 weeks they come to the Majestic Hotel, they talk their way, we talk our way, and we come to no result at all. But we did not know by then that Henry Kissinger already tried to have private and secret contacts with the other side. We knew it only later on in 1971. This kind of conversation between Henry Kissinger and the North Vietnamese, we didn't know about it. But myself, in contact with the international press, I had the kind of feeling that something going on without our knowing it. Once I asked Dr. Kissinger, well, I heard the rumors that, well, there is something going on. He didn't answer my question at all. He said that, well, everything we do, your president knows about it too. And immediately after getting along with Kissinger, I flashed back to Saigon in secret cable to President Thieu. I said that today I met with Henry Kissinger and I asked him, is there going on? And he said that your president knows everything about it. So I have to inform you about this conversation. So if there is a real conversation between the American side and you should know about it. You can think that it's not up to me to know about it, that is okay. But you should know that there is something. Isn't Ambassador Bunker telling you everything about it? I don't know, that is your problem, but I have to inform you that I have conversation with Henry Kissinger, I asked him about it, and he said that you know everything about it. So you see that it is a kind of very, very tricky situation that I found myself when I had to deal with this problem of getting in touch with Kissinger, guessing that there is something going on, but not knowing exactly what was going on. It was only in 1971 that it became public that Kissinger had private contacts with the other side. Now, the private contacts between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho and Sun Thuy lasted for almost a year, until October '72, when Kissinger came to Saigon and presented to Thieu a draft of what they call an agreement between the other side, between North Vietnam and the American, between Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger. The South Vietnamese government and President Tho and President Thieu was very, very unhappy with the draft agreement because they didn't know about it. They didn't know about it because later on, when I asked Hoàng Đức Nhã whether President Thieu knew everything about the private talks, Hoàng Đức Nhã said to me that Ambassador Bunker from time to time came to see President Thieu and briefly, well, in general terms about the situation going on. But I am not sure that President Thieu knows everything about how the terms of the Paris Agreement was negotiated until the time when Henry Kissinger came to Saigon and presented to him the draft of the agreement. The draft of the agreement was very, very in favor of North Vietnam. First of all, when he asked about a Vietnamese text of the agreement, there was no Vietnamese text at all. And when we asked about some clarification of the clause in the agreement, there is no clarification at all. And that is the reason why when Kissinger thought that he could get right away the agreement from President Thieu about the draft agreement, instead of it, he had some kind of rebuttal from President Thieu. He planned apparently to go to Saigon and after that to go to Hanoi. But he didn't get the approval of Thieu, so he had to get back to Washington. And it was at that time that he organized the press conference when he said that peace was at hand. That is a very famous press conference at which he said that peace is at hand. Now, Saigon was very unhappy with the draft agreement. By then I returned to Saigon already. I was a former ambassador and no more ambassador. But somehow President Thieu had some kind of idea about me. I did not understand why, but he asked to see me and he said to me, please help me. Go to Washington. It is too late right now, but you have to go to Washington to fight for something better than the draft agreement. And so that is the reason why I accepted to go to Washington again as a former ambassador. Not yet ambassador at large, because later on, a few months later, he found it more practical to appoint me as ambassador at large. But by the time I went to Washington about the draft agreement, I was the former ambassador. I saw Henry Kissinger, and I asked President Thieu to have with me former Foreign Minister Trần Văn Đô. Foreign Minister Trần Văn Đô was negotiating the agreement in Geneva in 1954. He was well known in Vietnam. So I asked President Thieu, please let me have a former foreign minister along with me in my mission right now. So both of us, former foreign minister Đô and myself, we went to see Kissinger. We talked about a very, very important point. And the very important point was the presence of the North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. The draft agreement didn't mention this problem. It is tacitly accepted that the North Vietnamese troops could stay in South Vietnam. But immediately after that, Dr. Kissinger returned to Paris. I follow him to Paris because I think that I have to follow him to see what's going on over there. And again he said to me that the foreign U.S. policy, the U.S. foreign policy depends on the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. And so I will try to do my best. But I don't think that I can have improvement concerning the clause about the presence of the North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. But apart from it, if your president is not going to sign the Paris Agreement, it will be the end of the aid to South Vietnam. The future of the U.S. foreign policy depends on the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, and it is up to you to sign or not to sign the Paris Agreement. But if you don't sign the Paris Agreement, it will be the end of Vietnam, aid to Vietnam. That is the word from Henry Kissinger. You see.
So, President did sign?
He paragraphed the Paris Agreement on 23rd of January, and it was later on signed by Secretary of State William Rogers. But in his capacity of National Security Advisor from President Nixon, he simply paraphrased the agreement. President Thieu sent to me a telegram at this time, because in the meantime he had exchanged very brutal words from President Nixon to President Thieu. Brutal words, you see, we have the text here. President Thieu asked me to give him a final report about the Paris Agreement. He said to me, don't send me cable anymore, because we know that the cable are somewhat, well, very, very easily led by the American Secret Service, you see. I am going to send to you a man who will arrive in Paris the next day, and he will bring back to me your report. So I stayed overnight, and I wrote a report of 23 pages to send back to him, telling him the whole truth about it, and telling him finally that it is the moment of truth, exactly the way Haig and Kissinger told me, the hour of truth. It is up to us to accept or not to accept the Paris Agreement. And I told him, if we accept, what could be the situation? If we do not accept, what could be the situation? And we made the middle choice, not accepting but not signing anything at all. What could be the consequence of it? So that is the kind of report in 23 pages that I sent back to President Thieu on this day before Kissinger put down his signature on the draft agreement by then. But it was the end, almost the end of South Vietnam by then. President Thieu couldn't do nothing at all. but it is a kind of de facto situation he had to accept, and he sent the foreign minister of South Vietnam to sign the Paris Agreement. Fortunately, there is a little bit of hope after that. Little hope in the sense that long before President Thieu tried to see President Nixon in the U.S., but the U.S. administration tried to avoid it somehow, you see, for one reason or another, you see. They avoid the kind of visit that Thieu could make to the U.S. But after the Paris Agreement, Nixon promised to Thieu that, well, we are going to see him, and so they invited Thieu to San Clemente in April 1973. I returned to Vietnam along with Thieu after the Paris Agreement signed, and in April '73, President Thieu accepted the invitation from President Nixon to go to San Clemente. To San Clemente, but not to Washington. And that is a kind of difference of that, a kind of nuances. Going to San Clemente is different from going to Washington. But anyway, President Thieu accepted. And he asked me again to accompany him to San Clemente. And at the San Clemente, it was quite a good meeting, because President Nixon promised to help South Vietnam, even to confirm that the U.S. would retaliate if there is a kind of violation of the agreement by the North Vietnamese. Up to a point that in the conversation between us outside the corridor, the Americans said that we will bomb them out. That is exactly the word of the American telling me. We will bomb them out. It means that if there is a violation of the agreement. So we came back after the San Clemente meeting. Mr. Thieu quite satisfied with the promise of Mr. Nixon to help South Vietnam, even in case of violation of the agreement. But just a few months later, not a few months, but a few weeks later, came to the U.S. the problem of the Watergate. And General Haig, who was scheduled to go to Vietnam, had to cancel his trip to South Vietnam. And by then, the whole U.S. administration was involved in the Watergate affair, and nobody talks about Vietnam anymore, until 1975, when the communists attacked in Ban My Thuột, and when, again, but this time as ambassador at large, I returned to the U.S. to lobby for the emergency help of 700 million. I didn't succeed at all, because the Congress refused to approve the aid, and I have to return empty just 10 days before the final days of South Vietnam. And that is the end of history by then for South Vietnam.
So you were dealing a lot with Kissinger from beginning to end. What kind of people, person, anything?
Well, he is a very brilliant man, very intelligent man, but his way of operating with all of us in South Vietnam is not the kind of openness a kind of frankness that we expected from a big nation dealing with a small nation like ours. We put our hope in the Americans, but somehow it was a kind of manipulation, diplomatic manipulation from Henry Kissinger. He didn't tell the truth to President Thieu until the last minute. He didn't tell to me at all about what was going on. And the South Vietnamese were put in a very, very dangerous, awkward situation of having to accept a very bad agreement, or if not, accept the end of South Vietnam exactly the way Henry Kissinger and General Haig put it to me, you see. So I think that it is a very, very bad way of dealing with a small ally like South Vietnam. And it is a very, very crucial lesson for the South Vietnamese to learn about how to deal with the big nation. And I do think that all the small nations around the world have to learn from the Vietnamese lesson too, not including the Americans themselves. They have to learn from the lesson of Vietnam, because the problem of intervention in Vietnam happened in the 60s and the 70s, but right now they have to deal with the same problem of intervention. The kind of situation that we have to accept the help of the Americans, but we sincerely hope that the Americans, with their tradition of freedom and liberty, would withdraw from South Vietnam. I remember that once in Paris, just at the anniversary of the Paris Agreement in 2003, in a conference organized by the French Foreign Ministry, I said to the audience by then that you talked about the American presence in South Vietnam. Well, we cannot deny it, because there was 500,000 men of U.S. troops in South Vietnam. But in the same time, nobody can deny that the Americans did intervene in South Vietnam only very late, and that they didn't have any territorial ambition like the French in South Vietnam. I said in an audience like that. And I mentioned that by the time the Americans were in South Vietnam, there were also almost hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops in North Vietnam. Why don't you talk about the presence of the Chinese troops in North Vietnam? You see? So talking about the Vietnamese being the puppet of the American, I would say that it is a kind of insult to the South Vietnamese.
So what do you think about Ho Chi Minh? Because also in textbook, American textbook, they said Ho Chi Minh was the father of country of Vietnam, who brought independence, freedom and happiness to the people.
Yeah. Well, you know that for a time in the leftist circle in Europe, they said that Ho Chi Minh can be a Tito in Asia. But the reality was quite blunted later on, and everybody knows that Ho Chi Minh tried to use the platform of fighting for the independence of Vietnam but in the same time, himself and his successors tried to impose the kind of Stalinist, Maoist regime into the whole country. And it is a situation the way right now. In China, you have the same regime. They develop the economy, but they control politics. And in South Vietnam, we have the same situation, a beginning of development in economic terms, but in the same time, a very strict control of the political situation up to the point that they have the monopoly of the political situation over the whole country.
My last question, how do you settle yourself and your family in the United States?
What?
How you settle yourself and your family in the United States?
I would say that in spite of the contradiction of U.S. foreign policy, which somehow became the causes of the disastrous ending of South Vietnam in '75. In spite of these contradiction, we South Vietnamese, we cannot forget the way South Vietnamese were treated around the end of the war by the U.S. administration and in the same time by the U.S. Congress, who refused to add the South Vietnam. I read the other day an article from an American journalist who said that the Vietnamese didn't fight at all. They have all the ammunition, the modern equipment that they need to fight the war. I would say that it is a lie, because everybody, all the American knows that around the months at the end of the war, there was no fuel for Vietnamese plane to fly. There is no ammunition for the Vietnamese to fight on the front line. It was a complete lack of ammunition that the Vietnamese had to suffer the defeat in '75. While in '72, the way I mentioned to you earlier, they fought well against the North Vietnamese in pushing the North Vietnamese back to the frontier, in reoccupying Quang Tri, in reoccupying Hue, in getting back to Xuân Lộc. All this kind of fighting. We had the ammunition by then, and we had the support of the American plane by then. But later on, even the small amount of 700 million was refused. But then I talked to the American legislator. I said that from '72, we didn't ask for American blood anymore. We asked simply for American aid, American military aid, and American economic aid. So we fought it ourselves, but you refused to help us at the end. I wrote in my book that it is not the finest hour in the American history when the U.S. Congress refused to accept the aid of 700 million for the South Vietnamese. But in spite of that, getting back to your question, I would say that we do not forget it, but at the same time, we have to see that hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese, thanks to the generosity of the American people. So the South Vietnamese were accepted right now on the American soil. And it is a very, very good situation for all of them. And they have to thank the American because they grow up with the new generation of Vietnamese American right now, doing very well in the American society. So it is a kind of mixed feeling that I am telling my fellow Vietnamese. We have to thank the American for having accepted so many Vietnamese right now on the soil of America, exactly the way you try to present the history of the Vietnamese community in the US right now. But history is a history. If we don't forget the history, well, it would be for us to remember, and for the American to remember too. But the present situation is different. We have 100, almost more than 1 million of Vietnamese right now in the US. Our children right now live in freedom, they prosper. They are citizens of the new country. They are proud citizens of the new country, and it is thanks to the generosity of the American people, and we have to recognize this fact. In spite of the fact that history is a history.
Will you come back to Vietnam if the communists no longer there?
Yes, by the day when there is no more communist government in South Vietnam, I would be very happy to come back to South Vietnam, as you say, but not now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Share your...
Well, when you mentioned to me that you are trying to make a film for the benefits of the young generation of Vietnamese, I accepted willingly because I think that the new generation of Vietnamese, we call it Vietnamese American right now. They go to the American school, American universities, and most of the time they go through American books or American TV program. And most of the time it is a kind of view from the American view, and we cannot blame it for being somewhat biased in favor of their views, you see. So what you are doing right now is quite useful from my point of view, in the sense that it will help the South Vietnamese, the Vietnamese American to understand why they are in this country right now, and why later on in their future they can help Vietnam to develop it into a free and prosperous country again. That is my hope.
Thank you very much. Can you state your name and your profession?
My name is Bùi Diễm. In Vietnamese we say Bùi Diễm. I was for a time between 1966 and 72 ambassador of South Vietnam to the US. And later on, when I got back to Vietnam after 72, I served as ambassador at large for Vietnam, mostly with the responsibility of going around the world and promoting the cause of Vietnam.
Wonderful. Sir, this is our second interview with you for documentary film Journey to Freedom of Vietnamese American, and we would like for you to help us to shine on some of the historical events, especially the mission of or the effort of lobbying for the aid to South Vietnam to fight the last days in the war. Can you recall that right after the peace agreement, Paris peace agreement signed, where were you and what you were doing at that time? Can you recall?
Well, if we can talk about the beginning of the withdrawal of the US from Vietnam, we should start it by the signing of the Paris Agreement in January 73. And all of us, we know that with the signing of this Paris Agreement in January 73, the US withdrew its troops from Vietnam and continued to aid South Vietnam to defend itself against the communists. But after the signing of the Paris Agreement in 73, January 73, President Thieu was invited by President Nixon to visit the US. And so that is the reason why we had the meeting between President Nixon and President Thieu at San Clemente in April 1973. I had been asked by President Thieu during the preparation of the Paris Agreement to try to convince the American negotiator that, well, the North Vietnamese troops should be withdrawn from South Vietnam, but we didn't succeed, and the Paris Agreement continued to disregard this problem of the presence of the North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. But somehow the Paris Agreement was signed, and in April 73, President Thieu had the opportunity to come to the US and had a meeting with President Thieu in San Clemente. During the meeting of San Clemente, of course, President Thieu sought to have the continuation of the US aid to Vietnam, and both in military terms and in economic terms. In military terms, it had been, of course, the concern of the South Vietnamese about the continuation of the communists from North Vietnam to continue their war against South Vietnam. And as far as this problem is concerned, that President Thieu did receive some kind of assurances from President Thieu, from President Nixon, that if it happened that the North Vietnamese committed some kind of violation of the Paris Agreement, the US would react to help South Vietnam. That is the kind of promise that President Nixon gave to President Thieu at San Clemente. In terms of economic aid, President Nixon said that, well, the US would continue to aid South Vietnam, but in the same time ask President Thieu to go to Washington to lobby some of the US senators for the continuation of this economic aid. And that is exactly what President Thieu, after San Clemente, came to Washington and talked to a lot of congressmen and senators for the continuation of economic aid to South Vietnam. But you know that sometime around April and May 1973, in the US there was a very, very special development, and that we call later on the Watergate. And with the Watergate, we saw it right away that it was very difficult for President Nixon to keep his promise. He was almost absorbed by defending himself in the Watergate problem. But somehow, if we continue 73, at the end of 1973, we have seen that the U.S. Congress had voted a resolution to the effect that the U.S. troops in Southeast Asia should not continue to operate the way it had been done before. And so we saw that in military terms, as well as economic terms, there was a de-escalation of the U.S. aid to South Vietnam. And so the problem continued after 73, and in 74, the situation in South Vietnam, we have seen that the communists, they continue their aggression without having the U.S. reacted in one way or another. You remember that in 74 there was the Battle of Bình Long, a big battle in which the communist North Vietnam committed a lot of their regular divisions against South Vietnam, but there was not a single sign of reaction from the U.S. the way it had been promised by President Nixon to President Thieu at that time of the Sacramento meeting.
So, I believe from published by many others, they mentioned about President Thieu would hesitate or have many points against the peace, the Paris Agreement, and was promised by President Nixon at the time, said if you sign it, and once again he promised that he will have U.S. troops intervenes if there attack or violation from the north. So the promise would have been made before the Paris Agreement. Was it true, sir? Can you elaborate that?
Well, it was clear in 73 that the political tension in Washington after the signing of the Paris Agreement, the political tension was somewhat down. But the atmosphere in the U.S. At this period of time was completely on the internal problem of the U.S. and, as I have mentioned before, on how President Nixon defended himself in the Watergate mess. And so the U.S. didn't think much in terms of how to help South Vietnam during this period of time. I came to prepare for President Thieu's visit in Sacramento, and sometime in March, before the Sacramento meeting, the atmosphere was completely relaxed about Vietnam. People in the U.S. thought it in terms of internal problem more than international problem, the way it had been before. And that is the reason why, to a large degree, the problem of Vietnam was somewhat out of mind of the U.S. They said that they got out already, and so they have to concentrate their attention to all the problem, internal problem as well as the problem in the Middle East, for instance, you see. And so we saw right away that there was a continuation of the degradation of the U.S. interest in the problem of Vietnam.
So I would like to understand once again about the promise that the U.S. had to President Thieu visit South Vietnam, even would lead to President Thieu before the Paris Agreement signed. And my next question would be, although promise could verbally promise, can you
that is quite an interesting point, because these promises were only the kind of verbal promises, you see, not the kind of written promise, the way it had been done in South Korea, for instance, or in Japan. There was a formal agreement between South Korea and the US and between Japan and the US to the effect that if there are problems with South Korean being attacked by North Korea, well, the US had the duty to intervene, you see. But not in the case of Vietnam, and that is a very interesting point that the Vietnamese have to remember in the future. If there is something to be done, it should be done in writing and approved by the US Congress, instead of, well, just a kind of verbal promise from the president. President can be one day for a one policy, but suppose that there is another president coming in, and the new president cannot is not obliged to continue the same policy advocated by the previous president, you see. In case of South Korea or in case of Japan, for instance, there are written agreement, and then all the president coming after the agreement signed before, well, they have to follow the same pattern, you see. And that is a very important point for the Vietnamese in the future, that if there is something with another big power on some problem, it is better to be on writing and approved by the US Congress than the kind of simple verbal promise from a president or from a Secretary of State like Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, he quite often said to me that you can count on us, you see. How we can count on him with this kind of verbal promise like that.
So, I believe that President Thieu was asked to visit U.S. Before the Paris Agreement signed. Was it true? And
yes, I had been in touch with Mr. Hoàng Đức Nhã, but then the private secretary of President Thieu, and many times already I had communication with him about this problem that we call it the fishing expedition, which was a kind of code name between himself and myself. Well, through the fishing expedition, we tried to convince the American government that they should invite President Thieu to visit Washington. But somehow, for one reason or another, and with one motive or another, the US declined this kind of suggestion from our part. And President Thieu was lucky to have an opportunity to visit the US at San Clemente when the Paris Agreement was signed already.
yes, people think that the present from U.S. Give to President Thieu for what he he did U.S. request by signing the Paris Agreement. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think that to a certain degree it was quite clear that just before the Paris Agreement being signed, there were talks between myself and General Hackett and Henry Kissinger, for instance. You see, it was implied that well, go ahead and sign the Paris Agreement, and after that it would be a kind of invitation to President Thieu to visit San Clemente. As far as this part of the promise, they keep it and they invited Thieu to San Clemente, you see, in April. But from my very personal point of view, I think that, well, a big power like the US behaved not a very elegant way with the South Vietnamese, because, well, on the side of the communist world, We heard that in Moscow, sometimes they call the South Vietnamese the bastards. But when North Vietnamese visited Moscow, it was always a red carpet, you see. So it was a very, very sensitive problem between the US and Vietnam during the whole war in Vietnam. President Thieu never succeeded in coming to the US itself, because the last visit on the US soil before San Clemente was Honolulu. I came to Honolulu with President Thieu. Well, that was the only visit of President Thieu had made it to the US at that time.
So you would mention that South bastard. Who called him and in what occasion? You remember?
Oh well, it was been reported in many press reports, international press report, rumors and quotations and a lot of things like that. Sorry, it had been mentioned many times already that those Russians, they were not always happy about the North Vietnamese, and I would presume that the same attitude from the Chinese was not far different from the attitude that those people in Moscow had in regards to the North Vietnamese.
I see. And they calling North Vietnamese as bastards?
Well, as I have said before, I heard a lot among the diplomatic circle that the Russians had a very bad idea of the North Vietnamese, but well, they receive it, you see, the North Vietnamese.
So and now we're back to San Clemente meeting. Do you recall what is the content, really the core of that meeting was?
Well, the core of the meeting, as I have just mentioned to you before, it was in two parts. In the military part, it was promised that if there was a violation of the Paris Agreement, the US would intervene violently, you see, retaliated against North Vietnam. And in terms of economic aid, the US promised to continue to aid South Vietnam, in spite of the fact that by 1973 and by 1974, it was down already, you see, not at the level we had before. And through some kind of manipulations inside the budget of the defense, you see, some of the part of the aid was switched from the economic aid to the side of the military part of the defense department. And so consequently the aid, economic aid and military aid to South Vietnam was substantially reduced, even before 1974 and 1975. And when in 75, when I came to lobby for an emergency aid in April 75, well, it was the final act from the US to cut more, to cut aid to South Vietnam. You know very well that I came to the US in April 75, in March 75, yes, to lobby for what we call an emergency aid of 700 million to South Vietnam.
So you just talk about the reduction of the aid from U.S. to South Vietnam. Can you recall when and what was the maximum that we got from U.S. and then from there it start reducing to 700 million, and you have to make a trip to try to secure that, but didn't have success. So can you recall what
I
was
don't
the
have
maximum?
the figures about the U.S. added to South Vietnam, but at that period of time. But I remember vividly that military aid and economic aid to South Vietnam in 74 and 73 was almost reduced to a mere around 300 or 400 millions.
Very good. Reduced from what number? What figure? The highest?
From at least 700 million before, you see. And well, we have to double check about these figures, but I remember that it was sometime between 700 million before, and it was reduced later on. And please remember that with the war in Israel and the oil crisis at that time, the cost of oil was very high, and most of the aid was consumed by this kind of high cost that we had to pay for many part of the U.S. to South Vietnam.
In the trip that President made in 1973, did he see anybody in Congress? House and Senate?
Oh yes, when we had been in San Clemente, President Nixon had some kind of advisors to President Thieu about how to lobby the U.S. Congress for the continuation of U.S. to South Vietnam. And consequently, after San Clemente, President Thieu came to Washington. And from advisors of President Nixon, he visited a lot of senators on the budget committee, Senators Standish, for instance, and some other senators, in view of explaining to them the need of South Vietnam for the continuation of aid to South Vietnam. And in fact, that Mr. Thieu did visited a lot of U.S. senators and congressmen. I went along with him at that time.
How was it, the atmosphere when those meetings went?
Well, the atmosphere was quite correct at that time because, as I have mentioned before, there was no more political tension that we had during the war. So the conversation was okay, all right, but they advised us to continue to lobby for U.S. aid in contacting a lot of congressmen and other senators, and that is exactly what we did later on, without much success, I have to confess. But we continue a lot after this San Clemente meeting to visit the U.S. congressmen or visit the U.S. senators for U.S. aid to Vietnam. But unfortunately, we didn't succeed much.
That you value like a diplomatic, but not much action.
Well, there is no possibility of more action than what we did at that time, because we have to remember that in South Vietnam after 73 we have a lot of problems in terms of how to face the continuation of attacks from North Vietnam.
My question was those reaction from senator and congressman, they very much like diplomatically meet delegation from Vietnam, but
Yeah.
that's what I meant by.
Yes, and we invited a lot of U.S. congressmen and senators to visit South Vietnam at that time, but you remember that there are a lot of congressmen from the U.S. Who are very much on the left side of the political spectrum. And the lady, if I remember well, Abdul Aziz, the lady with the hat who came to Vietnam and who...
Yes, you're talking about the actress Jane Fonda.
Yeah. But anyway, the interest of the U.S. In South Vietnam was not at the level it should be for Vietnam to defend itself. And the continuation of the attacks from those people who sympathized with North Vietnam continue. And that is the reason why it was difficult for the U.S. congressmen who were on our side to continue to vote for the same amount of budget that they had given before to South Vietnam.
Wonderful. So from visit by President Thieu until 1975 that you have the mission from President Thieu came to U.S. To try to for I call it the impossible mission for fighting aid for Vietnam. Since that period of time, from 73 to 75, can you describe what was the
briefly,
effort of?
Briefly speaking, the situation in South Vietnam deteriorated beginning by 74. The economy of South Vietnam by then was in bad shape. The civilian government employees and the families of the soldiers, they were in very, very bad shape in terms of economic situation. Adding to that, the situation in Vietnam in political terms was serious too, because there was opposition to President Thieu. That is the reason why when, after the attack from the communist side in the area of Bình Long, where the communist side committed a lot of regular divisions, their own regular divisions, we had serious problem both in economic terms and in military terms. This situation continued at the end of 74 and the beginning of 75. And as I have mentioned before, there was not a single reaction from the US side in terms of how to react to the communist attack, because it had been clearly demonstrated to everyone that the communists violated the terms of the Paris Agreement. To a certain degree, this kind of attitude from the US encouraged the North Vietnamese to continue their attacks against South Vietnam, especially when they received a massive aid from the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So the situation in South Vietnam deteriorated in both economic terms and in military terms up until the beginning of 75. And on March 75, if I remember well the date, the communist side attacked the South Vietnamese in the city of Ban Mi Thuột. And the South Vietnamese lost the city of Ban Mi Thuột on the 10th of March 1975.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question right there. That many people later on, I interviewed, South Vietnamese officer and other politicians. They think that President Thieu intentionally abandoned Ban Mi Thuột to get attention from U.S. How is your comment on that?
Well, that is a very special aspect of the problem. I try myself to ask President Thieu about his decision to withdraw from Pleiku and Kontum in 1975 after the loss of Ban Mi Thuột. To be very candid with you, I never succeeded in having a clear-cut answer to this problem because Mr. Thieu refused to see me for one reason or another after 75, and I had never the opportunity to ask him the very specific questions about how he made the decision to withdraw from Pleiku and Kontum. But anyway, after the loss of Ban Mi Thuột in March 1975, Mr. Thieu asked me to come to see him. I remember very well. He asked me to go to the U.S. to lobby for an emergency aid of 700 million. I remember well. He talked in terms of a Vietnamese saying, as long as there is still water, we have to scoop it. Còn nước còn tát. He said to me that, well, you have to go over there and you have to lobby for this kind of very special aid of 700 million that we call emergency aid. But before going to Washington, please.
Can you continue?
Yes, and during the meeting of President Thieu, he said to me that, well, you go to see President General Cao Van Vien, who can describe to you the military situation. So I went to see Cao Van Vien after, sometime around the 17th or 16th of March 1975. Well, I saw a big map on the wall, and General Cao Van Vien described to me the military situation by then. I took the plane that immediately after seeing General Vien, but as soon as I arrived in Paris, the whole thing's collapsed. You see, it means that the withdrawal from Pleiku and Kontum was a military collapse because the communist troops ambushed the South Vietnamese troops on Route 7, if I remember well. And it was a very, very important defeat for the South Vietnamese because the operation of withdrawal from Pleiku and Kontum was not well planned, and that was the main reason why we suffer a lot of losses during this period of withdrawing the troops from Pleiku, Kontum down to Nha Trang. And by then the situation became extremely, extremely dangerous because at that time the North Vietnamese attacked the northern part of South Vietnam in Da Nang, and Da Nang fall in the same time. I remember well that I was in Washington at that time, seeing the whole thing collapse on TV, and trying to get in touch with the American side and to try to understand the situation. I understood then that President Ford had the intention to send General Nguyen and Shackley to go to South Vietnam for an on-the-spot survey of the situation. The situation in South Vietnam in military terms continued to deteriorate with the loss of Da Nang, and the North Vietnamese troops continued their march down to Nha Trang and Phan Rang. General Nguyen visited South Vietnam along with Shackley, and when they returned after a week in South Vietnam, I came to see General Nguyen and Shackley. Separately, I saw Nguyen, and he said to me that the situation is critical, but not in terms of completely lost. And he said that if we can have a supply for the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese troops, then perhaps we can stand it for a period of time. So according to General Nguyen, it was not completely hopeless. There are still some hopes. But when I saw Shackley at that time, Shackley had a very, very bad impression.
Shackley tên nó đánh vần sao bác?
S-H-A-C-K-L-E-Y, Shackley. Hình như thế, tôi double check ở trong cuốn sách của tôi chút nữa. Hắn là CIA nhưng mà Director of the Asian sector.
Bác nói lại cho con là ông Shackley là ai? Dạ, mời bác bắt đầu lại. Dạ.
I talked to General Nguyen, and I've just mentioned that, well, according to General Nguyen, the situation was extremely difficult, but was not that hopeless. I tried to see Shackley, the director of the Asian division of the CIA. Shackley was very, very pessimistic. He described President Thieu at that time as somewhat disoriented, you see, not saying the situation in a clear way. And so I was very, 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 very disappointed myself after seeing Nguyen and Shackley. And in the same time, just for a few more days, I continued to try to lobby for the emergency aid of 700 million. But somehow it was hopeless, exactly the way many of my friends described, because when I come to see congressmen, some of the friends who defend me before, who defended South Vietnam before, they tried to avoid me. So I saw clearly the sign of the U.S. decision to give up helping South Vietnam already. And in just a matter of few days, it was a clear-cut decision from the U.S. Congress. They vote no to the demand of the South Vietnamese and the U.S. administration. I have to confess that the Ford administration continued to do its best, but without much success itself, you see. And so the U.S. Congress voted no to the demand from the U.S. administration for the 700 million to South Vietnam. And by the time I took the decision that there is no more things to do in Washington, and I took the plane to come back to Vietnam around the middle of April '75.
So this is a personal question. Here you are in US and try your best, meet many people if they were willing to meet you, and do anything you can to try to have people, swing people mind that can come back and help South Vietnam in a critical time. And on TV every night you come home and you see the collapsing of the country. People die on, route number 7, and so forth and so on. And you draw in the conclusion that nothing more to do. They really abandon us now. What's your feeling like? Can you tell?
Well, I returned to Vietnam in the middle of April, just 1 week before the final collapse. I have noticed that there was a kind of, I had the feeling that the South Vietnamese, even at that time, still had a lot of illusions about the US. When I met with Vietnamese military men, they talked about rumors that, well, the B-52 can come back and wipe it out, the convoy from North Vietnamese. They talk in terms of Kissinger trying to talk to Moscow in view of having a political situation to save South Vietnam. As far as myself was concerned, I saw it clearly that, well, that is the end of the U.S. intervention in Vietnam. And when I saw the Prime Minister Nguyen Ba Can, when they asked me about the U.S., I said that, well, my opinion is quite clear. The U.S. has abandoned South Vietnam already. There is no way for the U.S. to come to help South Vietnam. It is up to us right now to try to get out of the situation the best way possible. But in terms of relying on the U.S., there is no more possibility of relying on the U.S. at that time. So it was a kind of big disappointment from my friends, both in the government and in the military, when I told them the truth the way I saw it in 1975, in April 75, when I returned to Saigon in the mid of April. And as I have mentioned to many friends already, I had almost daily contacted with Ambassador Graham Martin. As soon as I get back to Vietnam, he called me on the phone and said to come to see me right away. When I saw him, he asked me the first question, "Did you see Thieu?" I said, "No, not yet, because Mr. Thieu, well, would like me to see the Prime Minister, you see." So I didn't have the opportunity to see President Thieu. But the next day, Graham Martin called me again. You see. He said, "Did you see Thieu?" I said, "Not yet." And so he said to me that, well, perhaps I have to take the decision myself and to try to see him right away. He came to see Thieu on Monday. The 20th, it seems to me, and the 21st, Thieu, in a public TV session, resigned from his, from the presidency of South Vietnam.
So do you think that Ambassador Martin has something to do with that?
Well, I think that, I don't know exactly what Martin said to Thieu at that time, but I remember that in the few days before that, when he talked to me, he said to me that, well, you have to tell Thieu the truth. And I said to Thieu, "What truth do you want me to tell him?" "My truth is that the U.S. has given up South Vietnam already. You want me to talk to him in that terms?" He didn't respond to me at all, but on Sunday he came to see Thieu, and obviously he had some kind of conversation with Thieu, which convinced Thieu that there is no way for him to continue to be president and that he have to give up. And exactly what he did on April the 21st. I stayed for us in Saigon in few more days, and I asked Martin the way he promised me before, if you need my help to get you out. I called him that there is no place for me right now in Saigon, so I have to get out. And the next day he asked for a private plane from Bangkok, a small Navy plane from Bangkok, and I flew out from Saigon in this plane that provided to me by Martin.
What day was it, sir?
Well, it was Monday the 21st was the day Theo resigned, 22, 23, 24, 26, 27, something like that. I flew out just a few days before, 2 or 3 days. When I arrived to Newark, well, the communists bombarded the airport of Tanzania already. And so, the plane from Panam was the last to get out of Saigon on that day.
So did you Theo trip when who arranged for him to leave Vietnam after he resigned? Do you know anything about that?
No, I know nothing about it, but the American side that on Monday he resigned, and on Thursday he left Vietnam for Taiwan.
I see.
And of course I didn't see him from the time that I came back. I didn't see him at all.
You didn't share the feeling that I asked earlier about when you know that there nothing left for South Vietnam, and with all your effort, you know, you did everything and it didn't come to any result, and you.
Oh well, at that time during these hectic days in Saigon, there was a lot of rumors from all sides. You see, rumors from. Those people who wish for the U.S. to come back, the way I mentioned, they said that the B-52 would come back and wipe it out the U.S., the North Vietnamese troops. And there was rumors about the neutralistic government with the machination of the French ambassador Marion by that time. And there was rumors about Moscow trying to intervene in Moscow for a kind of division of South Vietnam down the 17th parallel, but not on the 17th, but down after perhaps including Hue, for instance. So a lot of rumors, you see, incredible rumors, you see. But as far as I am personally concerned, that I was totally convinced at that time that the U.S. had given up on South Vietnam already, and that there is no more room for doing anything at that time, and that is place for no one in South Vietnam if they wanted to think in terms of having a free South Vietnam at that time.
What's your feeling like at that time when you know that?
Well, a very sad feeling. I was sad at that time. I was sick at the same time, and my wife, I called her on the phone, and we had a kind of tacit understanding between us when I say that I am going to attend the wedding of a friend. It means that I am going to leave. So my wife asked me, well, you have to go right away, you see. And so I left Saigon on sometime 24th or 25th, just a few days before the final collapse.
I also heard that there was a effort of getting a loan from somewhere to support the troops, who are running out of bullets and gas and everything else. Can you elaborate about that?
Well, briefly speaking, I have to mention right away that when I talked to the military man, when I returned to Saigon, after Washington in April '75, I learned, well, I did learn before, but it was in a very, very stark terms when I returned that the South Vietnamese practically have no possibility of fighting the war at all, because, well, there is shortage of ammunition, there is shortage of fuel. The planes could not take off to help the South Vietnamese troop, for instance, you see. And the artillery group, for instance, they have a ration of 2 or 3 rations of bullet and in the morning, and as soon as they finish it, that is the end of it, you see. So in practical terms, while the North Vietnamese were massively helped by tanks and by a lot of heavy arms and ammunition, you see, the South Vietnamese lacked almost everything. So no more aid from the US, but in the same time, in terms of military situation in South Vietnamese troops, they have no more ability to fight the war, and they have to accept this very bad situation of having to defend it with practically almost without ammunition. And I point out one thing: very often the international press, when they criticize the South Vietnamese, they say that the South Vietnamese did not fight at all. It is completely untrue, because when we talked about defeated and about surrender, we never saw before general from a foreign army to kill themselves because they didn't want to surrender to the North Vietnamese. Talking about the French defeated in 1940. in 1940, the French defeated by the German in 19. We never listen about the French general committing suicide just for not surrendering to the German. And yet the South Vietnamese general, they did commit suicide because they didn't want to surrender. It is incredible, but well, that is the truth. And we have to mention it for generations in the future to understand that the South Vietnamese did fight, but in a in extremely difficult condition, and they committed suicide just for the honor of South Vietnam.
So talking about international press, during the time your mission fighting it for to rescue South Vietnam, did you get a chance to meet any press, and if so?
Oh well, I had a very frequent. I had very many frequent contacts with the international press during my career. I was a pressman myself, so I was in a very familiar terms with them, with all of them. And I have noticed that exactly the way it is right now in the US, the press in general terms was and still is on the leftist side, you see. Most of the time they have very liberal ideas about freedom and about corruption in the government here and there and so forth, you see. So in general terms, the international press was in favor, without knowing it, that they worked for the cause of the other side, you see. In 1968, for instance, when I came to Paris to observe the negotiations in Paris between Henry Kissinger and the other side, you see, there was protests from the students in Paris. It was like almost a revolution in Paris in 1968. Demonstration from students in Paris, demonstration of students in Germany and in almost everywhere, you see. And the international press was in favor of a kind of revolution, as if, well, the population was against the government in power at that time, you see. So it is no surprise to me at all when we talk about the so-called sympathy that the international press had for the communist side. You remember in Paris, Jean Lacouture and a lot of French journalists, they wrote a lot of things about Ho Chi Minh and about other people. And only after the war, after they visited Vietnam after the war, did they recognize that they were wrong in defending the cause of North Vietnam, because they didn't know much about North Vietnam at that time, and they know North Vietnam only after the end of the war. But well, that is an aspect of the international problems around the world, you see, and we have to confront this problem the way it had been and the way it is still in many cases.
So I asked you this in you talking about press criticize South Vietnam, and many of them said that well, the war, we lost the war because of corruption from government of South Vietnam. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I used to say to my friends that I laugh about it because corruption is everywhere. Even in the US they have corruption. It is only a matter of degree. I remember that in South Vietnam at that time, perhaps the most corrupted of the general, the maximum that they get is perhaps, well, not up to $1 million, for instance. That is the most important case, for instance. But right now, the North Vietnamese, they got hundreds and millions and billions in dollars, you see. So it is a matter of degree. Talking about Afghanistan and talking about Iraq, you see. Everywhere there is war, there is some kind of corruption. And the international press talked about corruption as if it was the only cause of the defeat of those people. That is completely wrong. Well, corruption we have. I used to say that South Vietnam at that time, of course, was not a paradise. But at the same time, it was not hell either. So, in the beginning of the establishment of democracy, we have to suffer a period of transition from one authoritarian regime to a freer regime in terms of toward democracy. We have all these problems in a human society, you see. So it is normal. It is unfair for the international press to put all these problems on the shoulders of the South Vietnamese by then. Take an example. The international press and the US press used to say that the Americans spent billions of dollars in South Vietnam. But how much the billions were spent in South Vietnam? The billions of US dollars spent by the US Army was on bombing and on, well, hot meals that the helicopters had to bring to the fighting troops, U.S. fighting troops in Vietnam. That is the kind of billions of dollars U.S. spent by the U.S. Army. I have to say that I am not an anti-American at all, not at all. But I have to point out the reality the way it is. And it is up to the Vietnamese to understand that in spite of its immense power as a kind of superpower, the American had a lot of influence around the world. And if we can secure the American aid, we should. But in the same time, we have to understand that there is a lot on the American side, and we have to understand the American system and understand in the same time the limits of the U.S. power, because there are a lot of limits, and we have to understand it.
I may go a little further by asking you that I see a lot of people criticize South Vietnam society, government and everything, and have very little anyone describe about North Vietnam, how the life like, and I interviewed some people who live in North Vietnam during that time, like writer Dương Thu Hương, and she described her life and the rest of the population, their life in one very strong sentence. She said that we live like animals. So that kind of life that South Vietnamese or any Vietnamese don't want to live, or anybody in the world don't want to live in. So can you explain why is that in the world that people ignore, the condition?
Well, it is a very easy to try to explain it, because you agree with me that the North Vietnamese for dozens and dozens of years they live in a very, very totally controlled society, and they know nothing about the outside world. You talk about Dương Thu Hương, for instance. Dương Thu Hương was very much in favor of the other side, and she participated in many of the operations when she had been in the north. And when she came to South Vietnam, she almost cried, because she saw the kind of very relaxed atmosphere that we had in South Vietnam at that time, you see. So it is quite understandable. In every communist regime, the population is under total control by the regime, and they know almost absolutely nothing about the outside world. Talking about the North Korean, for example, they don't know nothing about the outside world. And talking about the North Vietnamese in 1975, I have many members of my family coming from North Vietnam. When they came to South Saigon, they brought some bowls of rice and sugar, and they said that, they thought that in South Vietnam we lack everything and that we are slave of the Americans, you see. And they opened their eyes, but it was too late. And so that is the situation right now. Fortunately, there is the internet, and people now begin to understand more than the way it had been done before. And perhaps one of these days, you see, the whole population would understand it, would come up, and by then it would be the end of the communist regime. But it takes time. I used to say to my young friends that when I go around the country to talk to the students, I said that, they are lucky to have the opportunity to be in the US and to learn how much it means to be in a democratic country like the US. But in the same time, talking about Vietnam, they have to be patient, because the communists are still over there. Obviously, there was a lot of change already, you see. We have seen that from the 80, for instance, the end of 80 and to the situation right now, there are a lot of change, but it still takes a little bit of more time for the population to understand completely how much it is difficult to live under the communist regime. And so perhaps later on, in the next future, sooner than later, I hope, the people of South Vietnam and the people of North Vietnam would wake up and would see a more freer, more democratic, respecting human rights for the people with dignity.
So,
Yes, you
Yes.
ask again about.
who Ho Chi Minh was? Sir?
Well, there are a lot of books and literature about Ho Chi Minh. Most of the liberal press gives the impression all the Soviet that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, trying to save Vietnam from French colonialism. Well, my personal opinion is quite clear. If I can give him some benefits of the doubt, I would say that, well, there are few percentage in his mind for Vietnam. But most of the times when he worked for the third international communism, even when he was young, his mind was most of the time on the communist side more than a nationalist side. I remember well, he said that before his death that if I have to join later on in the next war, I would like to join Marx and so forth, you see. So, well, his mind is more on the communist side than more on the nationalist side.
So, I mean, the press, in the textbook, film, also the media, when they describe Lenin, Stalin, Mao in China, they all call them brutal dictator, and they describe them very clearly that those bad leaders kill their own people, so on and so on. But Ho Chi Minh, they have a very different, description that he, the father of the country who brought independence, happiness to Vietnamese people, and of course we don't see that. How is that happens? Sir?
Well, that is what I call it in the 60s, a kind of wave in the international world, a wave in favor of communism. I take the concrete example of the French intellectual that I used to call the intellectual of the left side of the Seine, les intellectuels de la rive gauche. You see Jean-Paul Sartre, we see Jean Lacouture. Jean Lacouture wrote in the book about Ho Chi Minh, but later on he visited South Vietnam and later he returned and he wrote another book completely different from the previous book. André Gide, the famous writer from the French, he was very much in favor of Lenin and Stalin and so forth. But when he visited Moscow and he returned, he wrote a book, Retour de Luxe. It means that after the visit to the Soviet Union. So it means that there was a time when the communist wave was much on the high time, you see. And when the communist wave was on a high time, and almost the intellectual around the world, almost the international press was in favor of the communists. It is only now that they begin to understand what does it mean to be communist and to have to live under communism.
Thank you for have that clear message. This is, I want to ask you also, here a lot of books, material, film, they call us South Vietnam, and you present South Vietnam in the United States. They call us, they call you American puppets. What do you feel about that?
Well, as a Vietnamese who worked in Washington during this period of time, I would say that the South Vietnamese depend too much on the American side, you see. And that is the reason why they gave to the outside world the impression that they were the puppet of the Americans. And the Americans themselves, in many cases, they didn't try to correct this kind of image at all. Not because they had bad intention, but they have a very special attitude. I used to say that the Americans were too much impatient, and when they came to South Vietnam, they want to do everything by themselves. It is a kind of temperament on the American side. They said, let us do it quickly, and after that we give it back to the South Vietnamese. But instead of asking the Vietnamese to do things, they did it themselves. And by doing it, they created the impression around the world that the South Vietnamese were a puppet. I was not a puppet at all. When I talked to President Johnson or to McNamara or to other high official on the American side, Dean Rush, for instance, or other people, I want an independent man. I point out to the American the kind of point of view of a Vietnamese. And just I have mentioned to you before, when I saw American President Johnson after the Tet attack of '68, I mentioned to him that, well, while the other side that have the AK-47, the Vietnamese soldiers still use their own guns and I asked President Johnson to give instruction to the effect that the South Vietnamese wouldn't have the M16. And in fact, the next day when I saw Clark, he repeated to me that, well, in fact, that President Johnson did give him instruction to provide M16 for the South Vietnamese. Just a little example among all the things, you see. But in the same time, getting back to your question, it is, well, the South Vietnamese were to a certain degree victim of the international situation at that time. I used to say that if I have to talk it in terms of how, well, the real cause of the defeat of the South Vietnamese in '75, I said that, number one, there is a stubborn French who refused to give back to Vietnam the independence that the Vietnamese people deserved. Second, that the kind of obsession from the communists who would like to impose on the South Vietnamese a kind of Stalinist, Leninist regime on the entire people. That is an obsession from their part, and that is the reason why they continue to wage war against South Vietnam. And the third cause, it was not cause but a kind of factor in it, the American intervention. They intervened, but they intervened their own way. And when they, after getting tired of the war, they left their own way too. And so that is one of the three main reasons that I said were somewhat instrumental in causing the South Vietnamese. Well, I repeat it again, and I am not an anti-American at all, but I am quite a realist. When I talk to the South Vietnamese, I ask them to understand the realities and understand the American system. Politics in America is different from politics elsewhere. And they have their shortcomings, they have their good traditions of defending freedom and human dignity, of course. But in the same time, they have a limitation too, and they have own way of intervening. And that is the reason why we talk about the situation in Iraq and in Afghanistan, for example. The same problem that the US encountered in South Vietnam, they met it in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And
So when you say so, you have analyzed and you said the three reasons. I see you talking about France, you're talking about North Vietnamese, you're talking about American, and you think that, what about South Vietnamese government?
of course, you see, I said to my book that the Vietnamese have to accept their own responsibility of the war. They had the wrong assumptions about the American. They thought that the American, the way they saw them after the Marshall Plan in Europe, they saw them defending the South Korean, and they thought that the American were the eternal defender of freedom and so forth. It is quite natural that the American, as a big power, have a lot of influence around the world. But in the same time, and in spite of the traditional values that the Americans kept for themselves, defending freedom, defending democracy, and defending human dignity, and so forth, they have their own system, and they have their own limitations, and we have to understand clearly this problem before relying completely on the American the way we did before in 1960s and in 1970s, you see. And it is a hard lesson for the South Vietnamese. They have to think in terms of depending on themselves first, you see. And right now, if the Vietnamese people have to defend themselves against the Chinese, they too have to think in terms of relying on themselves. You know very well that people in Vietnam right now used to say that if we go to the Chinese, perhaps you can save the party, but we lost the country. But we go on the side of the American, and we can save the country, but we lost the party. In fact, that we have to rely on ourselves. In our history, the savior of Vietnam was fighting against the Chinese alone without anyone helping them. And so we have to rely on the people itself in promoting freedom and democracy, and only through this kind of promotions of freedom and democracy, and relying on the old people that the Vietnamese can have the resources and the ability and the willingness to defend themselves against outside interference.
Yes, sir. You spend a lot of time and also effort to serve your country as a diplomat. And many people were thinking about Vietnam War. We lost it not because of the battle, but very much, from political side. So how do you feel, looking back, how do you feel about the loss of country personally?
Well, looking back at into the past, I think that it was very unfortunate that the people of Vietnam had to meet that unfavorable circumstances in the fight for the independence of the country. First of all, we have to remember that immediately the end of the Second World War, and after the defeat of the French by the German in 1940, the Vietnamese, for the first time after 100 years of domination under the French, the Vietnamese people saw some hope of getting back the independence of the country. But it was unfortunate for the Vietnamese people that the communists had the upper hand in conquering the power in Vietnam in 1945. And the Vietnamese people had to suffer from the communist regime from then on until today. And as I have mentioned in many of my books and writings, I think deep in myself that the nationalists in Vietnam were kept in a very, very difficult situation. In the 50s, they had to fight against the French for the independence of Vietnam. But they had no choice because the communists were in power by that time. They had no choice because they had to side with the communists for having an opportunity to fight against the French. Or they can make another choice to refuse to get along with the communists and try to have another way of fighting to gain back the independence of Vietnam. They knew very well that if they continue to be with the communists, the nationalists of Vietnam would be one of these days squeezed completely by the communists, by the very, very brutal regime of the communists. And so the choice for them was to side along with the communists to fight the French, or to stay, well, independent from the communists. The nationalists of South Vietnam by then had an opportunity later on in 49 and 50, because there was then the Bao Dai solution. They thought that perhaps it could be a way out, because that Bao Dai sought, at least on paper, the independence of Vietnam too. And so the nationalists of Vietnam sided with Bao Dai in the hopes that, well, if South Vietnam can regain independence again, it would be under another regime than the communist regime. But they discovered later on that the French had no real intention at all to help Bao Dai to gain the independence of South Vietnam. And that was the reason why, after the Geneva Conference in 1954, it was only after the Geneva Conference in 1954 that the Vietnamese in South Vietnam got in paper the independence, but in the same time the country divided into two parts, divided by the 17 parallel. Up north the 17 parallel were the communists, and down the 17 parallel was the Bao Dai regime. And the situation continued until the defeat of the French in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And by then we had the Geneva Conference. And the French by then had reluctantly to accept the independence of Vietnam. In 1954, we had up north in 17 parallel, up north in the 17 parallel, the regime of the communists, and down in the 17 parallel, the Bao Dai regime. But then we began to have the
Yes, can you continue about you analyzing about what happening and it lead to your feeling and looking back the war and the loss of South Vietnam?
well, I just mentioned to you the difficult situation in which the nationalists of Vietnam found themselves during the whole period of the war. First of all, they had to make a choice between fighting along with the communists against the French, knowing exactly that one of these days, under the communist regime, they would be squeezed out brutally by the very, very difficult regime of communism. But later on in South Vietnam, when the American came to help President Diem after the division of the country into two parts, up in 17 parallel were the communists and down the 17 parallel was the regime of Chief of State Bao Dai. He had been an emperor, but later on he took the title of Chief of State instead of King or Emperor of Vietnam. And the American became too interested into Vietnam only in very substantial way by the beginning of 1954 in helping the regime of President Diem. President Diem was appointed Prime Minister by Chief of State Bao Dai immediately after the Geneva Agreement. But in the same time, under the regime of President Diem, in spite of the fact that all the nationalists of Vietnam had a lot of respect for President Diem, his regime was somewhat very, very personal. Almost all the political party were excluded from the regime because President Diem concentrated his attention on those people around him and especially on those people from his family, especially Brother Ngô. The regime of President Diem lasted for 9 years until 1963 when he was overthrown by a coup d'etat organized by the military group of South Vietnam. And the nationalists of Vietnam, when they suffer of being excluded from political activities during President Diem's regime, they thought that they had some beginning of possibility for them to participate in the political life of South Vietnam. So it was under the regime of the military people, President Thieu, Prime Minister Nguyen Cao Kỳ, and so forth. And the military regime, but the military regime was in name because in spite of the fact that there were two generals at the head of the government, they organized a kind of normal election in 1967. And so General Thieu became President of the Republic of South Vietnam, and General Nguyen Cao Kỳ, the former Prime Minister, became Vice President. And it lasted until 1975. But when I talk about the nationalists of South Vietnam, or in general terms about the nationalists of Vietnam, I mentioned the fact that they had always in a very difficult situation. it was before, between siding of the communists and fighting the French. Later on, siding with the Baudai solution, in spite of the fact that it was a very imperfect solution due to the obstination of the French not to give back total independence of South Vietnam. And later on, under the regime of President Thieu, it was not really what we call a dictator regime, but a very, very strong authoritarian regime which excluded the participation of many of the nationalists of Vietnam. And until later on, they had to collaborate with the military people to survive during the whole period of the existence of South Vietnam until 74 and 75. It was a rather sad history for the nationalists of South Vietnam. They have to accept their responsibility in everything, in their conduct against the communists, in their conduct against the French, in their conduct against the Baudai solution, against their conduct against the President Diem regime. But somehow, during the almost 30 years of the war, beginning by 1945 until the end of South Vietnam in 1975, the nationalists of Vietnam never had a real chance to fight for the independence of Vietnam and in the same time to begin the democratization of Vietnam. And while there is a beginning of democracy, I repeated, a beginning of democracy under President Diem regime and under the military regime later on, it was a kind of a constant fight. They had to accept it under always imperfect circumstances. Real choice for true democracy and human dignity, they didn't ever have the chance to do it until the day they were completely submerged by the communist offensive, military offensive of the communists in 1975. It is a sad story, as I have mentioned to you before, and all the Vietnamese felt it. They thought that for a time that they could count it on the American, but they had wrong assumptions about the stability of the U.S. foreign policy. And so until the day they discovered that they could not rely anymore on the American hatred. So by the time they discovered it, it was already under the communist regime. So it is a very, very sad history, and I think that all the nationalists of Vietnam, they felt the same way I did.
So I know that you was the head of one national political party. That Viet. Can you tell me about when it was found and then some?
Well, it is a history of all the political parties of Vietnam by then, like the Vietnam Quốc dân Đảng, like all the parties in Vietnam. They began their fight against the French, and even before the coming of the communists, But by the time the communists came to power in 45, well, they lost this opportunity because the communists control everything. And so, well, it is a kind of fighting without possibility of winning everything in terms of democracy and freedom for the people of South Vietnam. The Dai Viet Party, like all the party, was founded in the beginning of the 40s, even before the coming of the communists by then, you see. So, myself as a young man, I knew nothing about it. I knew only, like all the young Vietnamese by then, that we had to fight for the independence of the country. But my joining of the Dai Viet Party was just a kind of circumstances through which friends or members of the families, they asked me to join the party, because the totality of the young men by then knew nothing about the Viet Minh, the communists. They knew nothing about the Dai Viet. They knew nothing about the Vietnam Kuomintang. Well, perhaps a little bit about the Vietnam Kuomintang, but most of the time they knew nothing about the Nationalist Party. They joined the Nationalist Party just by special circumstances. Whether they have friends who joined already the party, or they have their members of the family joining this party already. So my case was not different from all the case of the young Vietnamese by then. And so the totality of the Vietnamese people in the 40s, after defeat of the French in 1940 by the German, they saw an opportunity for them, opening the horizon. So the circumstances were for fighting for the independence, and all the Vietnamese people, whether they are nationalists or not nationalists, they knew but one thing: fighting for the independence of the country. And that is the reason why some of them joining the Dai Viet, some of them joining the Vietnam, some of them the Viet Minh. It depends on the circumstances. And so later on it became a kind of country divided into two parts, on the side of the communist and on the side of the non-communist. So that is a very, very sad situation of the Vietnamese people, who through the international circumstances by then and through the happening of the circumstances in Vietnam itself after the surrender of the French, after the surrender of the Japanese, and after the intervention of the Chinese troops, they found themselves under the communist regime in North Vietnam. It was a very sad story, and myself included in it.
So what is your last wish for Vietnam?
Well, I left Vietnam in a plane of the American provided to me for flying from Saigon to Bangkok. It was hopeless by then. And when I was on the plane, and then I look out of the window, the delta of Vietnam, fly out under the windows of my little plane, and I cried by then. Just 1 hour after, with my eyes blurred by the tears, the plane landed in Bangkok. And so that is the very sad story of a man who had to leave South Vietnam under very, very difficult circumstances like that. Leaving behind my friends, leaving behind my home, leaving all the things that I cherish in South Vietnam by there. And from the day on, I never returned to Vietnam. Very sad story.
Thank you very much, sir.